Welcome to chapter 30 and really the end of our lecture series. I'm not going to do another post for chapter 31 dealing with contemporary art just because there's a lot to talk about, but there's better just ways of showing how art has changed, and you can look and sort of visually compare how artists are taking from the past, right, the earlier artists that we've looked at to create some of these new dialogues. But modernism and postmodernism, now the reason why we sort of end at 1945 and then pick up again here in this chapter is that really postmodernism begins with sort of a backlash to modernity because of World War II, right? The idea is that if the Enlightenment, which spawned modernism, gave us technology, gave us this reason, gave us all this stuff that led us to these massive wars, then there must be something wrong with it. And so those writers, musicians, artists, everything after looking at that Second World War and it's done, saying, hey, we are all about the advancement of human knowledge and science and technology, but it can't be done this way. We have to do it a better way. They're interested more in sort of an overarching freedom to truth, to talk about things like identity, to talk about issues that came up with capitalism, with colonialism, right, and all these things that happened because of sort of the Enlightenment and the modernist sort of point of view with that technology. So there's a great little link there that helps explain some of the difference between the two, because the modernism and postmodernism really are working in a similar vein still. They're both sort of saying, like, yeah, this is all about human betterment, but it has to be done a different way, a new way, a better way. So that's what we're going to look at. And so after 1945, we have, global devastation. We've seen atomic weapons. Now we have this thing between the U.S. and the Soviets. Communism is on the rise. So there's a lot of things that are going on that just, spawn a whole new sort of set of works. This piece here by Giacometti is sort of an example of that, because he's using bronze. And when we think of bronze, it's a hard metal. It's meant to be sort of like thick, and it's supposed to show sort of strength. It's supposed to have like a refinement. It's considered a fine art. And here he's dealing with sort of existentialist ideas and sort of frailty within that, right? We have this elongated, isolated figure that's very fragile, and it's sort of spindly arms and stuff. So there's a lot of juxtaposition that's going on here. And this is how we can start to look at more of like postmodern works, is where they're calling into question those modernist ideas. A leading painter that's influenced by sort of the butchery of war is Francis Bacon, and he's painting scenes actually from Velázquez's paintings. He's taking a lot from other masters and sort of redoing them, and then putting these carcasses and these meats. I mean, it's very synonymous within his work. But he lived in London during the Nazi bombing, and used a lot of images from the news and current events to make abstract but political statements. His work is really just sort of called the brutality of fact, right? Like, this is the way it is, right? I'm not trying to sugarcoat it in any way, and it's dark and it's weird. And I believe that this is even an image of like a prime minister or something at the time, and he makes them sort of like these haunting figures. But all of this is still in response to the war. Now, because of the war, we do see those artists in the United States now. We also have a lot of new materials that the artists are able to get either super cheap or sometimes even for free, because as the war ends, there's a surplus of new materials, things like enamel paint or linoleum. Acrylic paint is also developed, and for the use in the war. It was never actually meant to be like for a painted surface. It was the idea that you could make a waterproof liner on anything, right? And so acrylic could be painted on, and once it's dry, it sort of have this like waterproof liner. Well, all these new sort of materials are now sort of just kind of left on the docks and the wharfs in ways. So artists are able to get their hands on it there, and they sort of just start responding to the times. Jackson Pollock being sort of the father of the abstract expressionist movement. He actually, his wife is now more credited with developing this style. Her name is Lee Krasner. We'll look at a work of hers, but she had been doing works like these for a while, and sort of inspired him, and was also his manager until he died in a drunk driving accident. And she then continued working, but this is the very first major American art movement. So abstract expressionism puts the art center and the art movement all in New York at this time, right? And now we are on the map as Americans with our work. And this is sort of this new style is sort of kind of like a way of showing that, like, the nonsensical in the war itself, right? There's no representation here. It's about movement. It's about fleeing. Pollock would, lay the canvas on the floor and drip this. He would really liquefy his paints down, sometimes using enamel, oils, acrylics, right? And just letting that stuff just build up on the surface by hovering above it and dripping. He would sometimes is credited with like jazz music, listening to it to sort of inspire there, but that doesn't really get too much. But here's his wife's work though, and this is done, and she would continue to work even after his life. But her works themselves are also in the abstract expressionist, that here we have things that even have shapes and have a little bit more contours, but there really is no representation going on whatsoever, and there's no meaning of emotion, right? That's another one of those things with abstract expressionism. It's kind of like trying to just make art devoid of any sort of reference to anything, right? When you look at this, the idea is that like the artist is not going to guide you to a specific meaning. You yourself have to make that up. Another that he gets lumped in with abstract expressionists, but because of the representation, he kind of has his own little vein going on. But he's considered in that with this sort of this figurative abstraction that's going on. Definitely watch the link, because this piece by de Kooning and his series about women have been really controversial. Here he's using ads from newspapers and magazines and stuff to create this woman's series. He's quoted as saying he thought of them sort of like as a Venus character, and if we think of like Venus de Willendorf and stuff, and sort of the larger breasts and sort of the over sexualization thing, right, of women genitalia, right? Okay, so maybe there's some of that, but he's really thrown himself into a hot debate still, to where maybe he hated women, and this caused outrage because it looked almost like a murder scene, and it was really sort of a completely new way to objectify women. And that's sort of the argument with it, is that there's a lot of them, a lot of feminist groups and stuff really sort of hate this work because there's nothing positive that they can find out of it. Another abstract expressionist, but also what's called color field painting, is Mark Rothko. And he really sort of takes this idea of devoid from feeling and stuff and brings it to a max, where he will just do these sort of like blends of color on a canvas, right, that never really go to the edge, right? They're foggy right up until we get to the end of the canvas. That we have a horizon line, so they kind of come off as landscape-esque, but they're really, once again, not supposed to mean anything. They're supposed to remove all subject or representation to achieve this more universal and spiritual way of looking at a painting, right? Mark Rothko is very interested in the idea of the sublime, and he's using color to help convey sort of the meaning of basic human emotions. So when you look at this, you will feel something, but all that's sort of predetermined by your experiences. Now, as we're moving forward in time, we have this post-painterly abstraction, right? Everything's sort of a backlash, and if an abstract expressionist ruled, there's a critic named Clement Greenberg, and he's just championing them. I mean, he's sort of the Michael Jordan of art critics, and so anybody and everybody listens to him. So if you don't get touted by Greenberg, then your artwork is nothing. Well, that is pretty problematic as far as controlling the scene. And so we see, some other movements. However, Greenberg even coined the phrase of this sort of movement, the post-painterly. But he's he approves of this, and so it kind of helps bridge out of abstract expressionism, right? Works in post-painterly abstraction focus more on like shapes and remove the painterly, the dripping, the splashing, and the throwing, right? This almost looks very machine-made. The focus really, though, by these artists is the purity in art, right? It comes off clean, comes off graphic. It's sometimes even called hard edge painting for that. But still, we're not dealing with emotions, right? We're not dealing with representation, but we're also saying that we don't have to always conform, right? We can still do what we want with the painted surface. Probably the most famous of them is Frank Stella. He really enjoyed even challenging the shape of the canvas. Why does it have to be a square or a rectangular shape, right? He took painting and removed everything he could from it, right? So that there's no image, no central theme or object. There's no painterly expression. There's no expression at all, right? There's just all this. Once again, almost looks machine made, and there's these simple lines. He wanted to simplify. To just be pigment on a flat surface, right? And create something that's interesting with such little as possible. Another art that really sort of helps to launch, and luckily the 60s, I would say, really helped us out with all the other cultural things going on. And it's called op art or optical art. Bridget Riley, she is sort of the champion of this. And it really shows like illusions of depth and movement in such a simple way, right? Understanding mathematically, we can see a combination between the post-painterly and this because they seem so precise, right? And that precision is really what helps drive their work. But basically, the way this started, though, is that the idea of taking something like pointillism from Seurat's Impressionist piece and bringing it here to the forefront, right? They're doing the same thing where they're dealing with opticals, they're dealing with the science of seeing, and sometimes this is even called neo-pointillism because of that. And don't stare at it too long because a lot of people can actually get motion sickness looking at it. So, and to continue sort of like purifying, right? If the post-painterlies are doing this, well, the minimalists are taking their sculptures and wanting that purity in the medium itself. They're just dealing with the steel, right? There's some used fluorescent lights or some used very simple wood structures, but all of them looks like they were machined, right? They wanted to reduce the works and primarily sculpture to non-expressive geometric forms that are only about the materials and the construction, right? They are simply 3D objects. That is all. So, take it as you will. Now, Donald Judd kind of gives us even a little bit more, and he's probably the more famous name of this. And if you ever are interested in seeing a whole compound of minimalist artwork, you can go to Marfa, Texas, way out in the middle of nowhere. It's where they filmed No Country for Old Men, and you will find an old military base that they bought and converted, and there's just minimalist artwork everywhere in it. But check out the link. I'll give you some more insight. Now, an artist that I would not consider minimalist, definitely kind of coming out of it, using a lot of their same ideas, but more of an assemblage artist is Louise Nevelson. And really, she is being inspired more by Dada and Surrealism. Because we're looking at these sort of fantastical spaces, right? Things that could mean something. Are they totems? Are they tribal? Are they constructs? Are they discarded, right? There's a lot of things in there that is really interesting to look at. But she wanted to express uh, the sort of the in-between spaces. And this piece itself actually comes off more like an altar or a shrine, right? We even sort of have sort of the hinging on the sides. When you walk into it, right, it's actually sort of in this L shape or in this sort of concave shape that you look like you can like walk up and in there and it'd be a place where you could pray or meditate. And also we have Louise Bourgeois, and her works too are continue on using a level of abstraction to suggest sort of these forms that are human in ways, but maybe not. She dealt a lot with sexuality in her work, and this piece is carved out of marble, but yet it looks like it should be soft. It looks like it should, be something that you can touch, but then at the same time you're almost kind of repulsed by it. She's a multimedia artist, also inspired by surrealism, and she had a she had a great sort of breadth of work. If you're ever interested in sort of somebody who really sort of goes for the purity of the material, she's incredible. Now, with this, as it continues to push, we actually have in England, of all places, the first, what's considered the first pop art piece. So this is Richard Hamilton's piece, and it's kind of playing off of Hannah Hawk when we looked at the Dada work and the photo collage or photo assemblage that she was doing. Even using the same sort of like pop art. So when you could put these side by side and really compare and say, wow, without one, you couldn't have the other. But this is sort of confronting us as a viewer of like what modern culture has put in our life, right? When we look around and we see the television and we see the advertising and the consumption rate that now we are. I mean, this is the 50s, so this is, now we're sort of, I don't know if the world's ever at peace, but we're considered a little bit more peaceful time for most Americans. And from there, we're sort of ramping up production as everybody's come back from the war. We're now the number one superpower in the world, right? The art world is on our side. So all of this is sort of like generating into a massive economy for us. And but it's interesting that we get it. Pop art is sort of this strictly American thing, but it really did start in England. And you could say that the Americans are the ones who really pushed it forward because we had artists like Jasper Johns, and he's drawing attention to common objects, which is what popular pop art really is trying to do. He's looking at these regular objects for their formal qualities, right? Lines, shapes, colors. But here is not a flag, but a repetitive shape. Now, these canvases are actually layered on top of one another. So it's like 3 canvases on top of one another. And he's using that encaustic medium, which is, the pigment and wax. And he's really kind of playing off that other piece that I talked about in last chapter of Magritte's This Is Not a Pipe. When you look at it, you're basically saying, well, this is not a flag. This is a canvas, right? This is a painting, but it is a painting of a flag. So yes, it is a flag, but it's not an actual flag, right? This almost becomes a non-patriotic image, with the repetition of it, right? It's now just an image. So he's really sort of trying to deconstruct some of the symbols for us, and you can check out that YouTube link if you're interested in more about it. Now, a friend and actually a companion for a while with Jasper Johns was Robert Rauschenberg, another major influential artist in my life. And his works, he would sometimes call like assemblages or combines. And he's got sort of an interesting background because he comes from Texas. He gets out of the Navy and after the war, and just kind of living in New York City, and is walking around the block where he lives, and he's taking these materials that are left over from the war and just sort of using whatever he can get his hands on to create works. Some of his theories is like, well, there's already so many images made. Why do I need to make a new image? As in, like, why do I need to draw the human figure, or why do I need to do a still life or something when I can just take the images around me and start bringing them together? A new way of collaging. But he calls them combines because we're using 3-dimensional objects, and newspapers and cardboard and all that, and we can see that he's not really trying to paint, but he's using that abstract expressionist sort of dripping and that modeling And he really does bridge the gap between the abstract expressionists and the pop artists. Without Robert Rauschenberg, there would be no true pop art because he's using things around us and, everyday detritus and try to sort of highlight it even more. So that's where he and Jasper Johns really get a lot of credit. Clement Greenberg was definitely not a fan of pop art, so we needed the artist to in the market to say, hey, this is popular, this is selling, and sort of like start to lead us into that. But yeah, he's using these, what sometimes he also calls ready-mades, which is very Duchamp. He's very inspired by Duchamp and Duchamp's works where, like a urinal and making it art. Well, this is a, taxidermy raven. Amazing, really. He's painting in that abstract expressionist style. I would not call him a pop artist, though. He's really in the sort of a league of his own. And he even started using silkscreen way before anybody else was. So silkscreen will become like Andy Warhol's go-to and some of the other painters. But really, Rauschenberg figures out like how to use it well, and in sort of that idea of reproducing and printing again and again what he needs around him. So some true pop artists. Roy Lichtenstein, known for his comic books, subject matter, right? Sort of like he emphasizes these Ben Day dots. So if you zoom in really close, you can see all those little tonal dots everywhere. And he's painting this stuff by hand, right? And so he's really emphasizing giving us one scene. Comics to him were sort of a discarded medium, and that he wanted to reevaluate them. And so he put them at life-size proportion for us to really sort of think of the dialogue that's happening in them. Of course, Marilyn Monroe being depicted here by Andy Warhol. And I would definitely say look at the link. There's a lot to dive into with Andy Warhol. There's a lot to study with him. He's just the most famous pop artist. He mass produces images to make social commentary, but at the same time doesn't really claim to be making any social commentary. That's what's sort of the enigma about Andy Warhol is he's kind of just a mirror to the society in that moment, and doesn't really even come out to say that he's making a statement. He gets his start as a shoe designer, and his actual name is Andy Warhola, and he's from a mining community in Pennsylvania. Was Catholic and went to church every Sunday to the day he died with his mother, of all things. He was shot, but survived that and died, a few years later afterwards, but shot by a gal that was a kind of crazed fan of his. But he created a sort of a huge, interesting artist collaborative called, the workshop there, or the factory, sorry, and his sort of like following of artists. He would bring in like the Rolling Stones and to do their portraits and stuff, but then everybody'd be hanging out and there would just be everything going down on this like flat in New York. And yeah, he just sort of surrounded himself with pop culture. Pop art that really can maybe even do more of a statement. And one of my favorites is James Rosenquist, and he was actually a billboard painter turned fine artist. This piece itself is 86 feet long and 10 feet high. It consists of several segmented panels, and you can see them individually here, where he's painting on them by hand, right onto metal and aluminum. So he's doing a lot of interesting stuff there. This image is, I wrote a paper about it once, considering it sort of like the Guernica of the Vietnam War. This idea that here is this jet that's this underlying composition here. And this jet is actually the most costly design for the Vietnam War and was actually never used, right? The F-111. It could be a protest piece. There's not a whole lot of proof of literature saying that he painted it as a protest piece. But there's a lot of symbolism in there that allows it to take on that reference. Sculptural pop artists, there's like Klaus Oldenburg, and there's a film on Canopy that I have there for you guys. He started with works made of plaster and relief and assemblages, and then he really became more famous for his soft sculpture. He shows sort of comments and as a artist about consumer commodity and with the ideas being displayed. This is actually installed on, well, it's called Lipstick, and change that right quick. And what he did is he put this lipstick as sort of like a phallic symbol on this caterpillar tracks, and put it next to the dean's office there at Yale, where he was a student. And he installed this on the Ascension Day, which is the day that Christians believe that Christ rose into heaven. And it was known, and this is sort of like his Vietnam protest piece. It originally had a blown up lipstick tip that had to be inflated. So somebody'd have to stand on the platform and sort of blow into this thing, and it would, slowly puff up. But over time, they remade it and made it all out of steel and what you see to this day. So to make it more permanent, and they also, of course, relocated it. But now it's this famous piece, even though it was kind of made as a quick joke. Also, we have some feminist commentaries with sort of pop art, right? And the only thing really pop about this is sort of the outfit itself, with the bright colors that maybe are a little bit more synonymous with time. But Niki de Saint Philae is a feminist who's using her works as sort of commentaries on beauty and women as well as race. And so she's sort of at the end of pop art. And once again, another one of those artists I think is similar to sort of like a bridge into newer movements, instead of specifically one like pop art. Now, some artists, as we all know, start to reject, and they're interested in sort of superrealism. And Chuck Close, this is where he gets his start, and he's still alive to this day. But superrealism, or sometimes also known as photorealism, aim to record as much visual information about from the photos as possible, right? So they're not drawing from life; they're taking that photo and being able to craft what they want, and then sit down with that image and recreate it. It's not created; these works are not actually created for expression or drama or even interesting, right? This is a self-portrait, but he does a lot of just like regular, ordinary people. They're not heroes; they're not pop stars. And so, while Andy Warhol's doing Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley and any celebrity can get his hands, this Chuck Close is like, I don't need celebrities. I'm going to sort of show the amazement in the everyday individual. But through the process and the way he's perfecting this, it's sort of overwhelming, and the sublime experience is made because he did it by hand. This is not reproduced in any other way. So it's kind of re-elevating man to this idea that we don't have to always use technology. We don't have to use all these sort of other mechanisms. We are still very capable of doing this. Not someone who's considered sort of the super realism, but in the detail, but realism, kind of like how Courbet was doing realism, just sort of showing somebody not really trying to pose, right? Here's this nude, but not really trying to pose, right? Not really trying to be set up in a certain composition. It just almost looks like every day, like they're laying there. He would paint anyone. And Lucian Freud would. He'd paint anyone, and he was interested in beauty and ugly, and working to define really what that means, right? Is this person beautiful and ugly by our standards? Is the scene, is the way it's painted, so he's doing a lot of stuff that, even down to the posture, right? Is this beautiful or ugly? Or, he's just calling into comparison quite a bit. And the YouTube link explains a lot about his works and why they're so important to us. Another super realist, though, for truly sort of the details, is Dwayne Hansen, and I really love these works because he works a lot from photos, but then he would cast, he knew how to cast people, and so he perfected that, and he's using polyester resin, and so you take photos of everyday people, and then you work up a clay model, and he's then from there making casts of these individuals. Now, sometimes he'd actually get people to pose, and he could cast them, or take copies that could be cast of them. But it's amazing because after he casts them, he cleans them, he airbrushes them, then he puts them together and puts the real objects with them. So if this was standing near you, you almost could not tell the difference. right? Like it's almost like those weird mime statues in parks in Paris or something that want you to pay them money or they'll kind of jump out at you, but they just stand there perfectly still. In feminist art, which is going on now, we were just kind of there in the 60s and now we're almost through the 70s, but feminist art really gains a foothold because there's just such a call to action in the 60s. And so artists are able to get together in groups and really start to put out their own publications, things like that. And the feminist artists, they have a group called the Guerrilla Girls, and these are women that would, and still to this day do this. They would put on gorilla masks, and they would protest and sort of band together to make political statements about why there are so few feminists or women in art. The really sort of one of the leaders and now considered probably the most famous feminist art piece is Judy Chicago and The Dinner Party, and great film. There's a lot of resources on there, but she really began to question sort of the power and the persuasive powers that art has, and uses those to sort of elevate women and to add them and to literally give them a seat at the table, right? That sort of figurative analogy. And so this work was made to include women in historical narratives and museum shows. She's one of the major players in feminist movement and created works to help and helped organize the movement. The floor is inscribed with major women in history, and then there's an individual dinner plate designed for each woman artist at the plate. So each one of these settings is very specific to an individual. And like I said, it's like bring in all have a seat at the table. Of course, doing it triangularly is the symbol for the feminine. And so that, not making it sort of the square, long, almost phallic shape, but we have another sort of like reference to the feminine that goes back to even classic antiquity. It's a really amazing piece with a lot of individual meaning. So if you're interested in feminist art, definitely take a look at this work. Photography, though, and a feminist photographer, Cindy Sherman, she really wanted to subvert the male gaze through her photos, and so she dresses up in these stereotypes of women roles. She actually starts by dressing up in specific ways from adult films that are being made at the time. So she's kind of taking that idea like pornography and sort of switching it. She'll later just, and even to the day she still works, she will continue to sort of question that gaze, but dresses herself up and works not in just the adult films, but she's sort of subverting the way women have been shown in Western art. And in her work, she is now in control and can choose when the viewer gets to look, when she gets to take the image. And you can actually see that cord right here, and it then will go up to her hand. And so she's snapping these photos herself with her camera, which, once again, is that idea. She's got the power to show us what she wants to show us, right? So she's getting herself the way she wants before she's then sort of consumed. In textile arts, and I love Magda Abbott-Kanowitz. She's a textile artist and a trained weaver. So we're using some new materials that we usually are sort of seen as craft, right? Especially women's craft work. It would sometimes be stereotyped, and so she's using these textiles to add the things that are associated with women to talk about the human spirit and to talk about humanity in general. And I mean, just amazing works. These are all cast pieces of burlap that are then coated in resin and cast again and again and then placed in a landscape. Architecture, continues to challenge the modernist idea. Modernist architecture is really defined by simple shapes and very little ornamentation, like when you think of Frank Lloyd Wright and stuff. So they wanted to subdue that by sort of creating simple geometry. And this is still Frank Lloyd Wright, though. From his other pieces, you can see where this is why he's such a monumental artist for architecture, is that he's able to get into these new sort of ideas on what we can do with the building. Le Corbusier, here we have sort of this space that's combining both sculpture and architecture. All right, so we're looking at sort of these new models. I had a documentary on Moodle through a YouTube link for you guys to look at and about this piece, but Zahn has worked briefly with Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's using this reinforced and casting concrete to create these structures. So I'm not really a specialist on architecture, so I will let those videos sort of explain more if you're interested in it. But building material wise, these are new. We're using different synthetic resins within the concrete, so we're able to get new forms, more dramatic forms, and we're pushing those boundaries as architects. Postmodern architect though. Postmodern is just not a unified style at all. It's kind of, what is this? What are we going to do? It's just sort of calling into question everything and trying to, if this is the way the modernists are doing it, then we're going to do it sort of a different way. And so architecture in the postmodernist style was inverting everything that had been done before. So here in the Pompidou, we see in this museum where they've taken the guts, what you'd see on the inside, the stairwells and all the ductwork and everything, and they brought it to the outside, right? So usually those are things that are inside. And so this is actually a huge sort of symbol for postmodern work at the time, is this piece of architecture. The architects Rogers and Pisano Paiano are about the sort of the complex and eclectic, and sort of making something that has all that ornamentation, right? Because modernist architecture that we just saw, it really wasn't about that. It was simple forms and designs, where here they're going to clutter things up and add quite a bit. Environmental art, huge movement really that still is being sort of played with in many aspects, like Andy Goldsworthy and stuff is a contemporary who's doing this. But we have Robert Smith, and his artwork career would be even longer if he had not died. I think it was a helicopter crash while sort of scouting for other sites to do work in. But he does site-specific environmental works, and he's taking in the surrounding landscape as into consideration. They're also known as earthworks. They're like architecture and sculpture put together. The movement started in the 60s, but Smithson was a pioneer in that. He used construction equipment to move all this material, and when it was designed, there wasn't actual water there. And the YouTube link has some really cool images where he actually created this before, sort of like a bridge between the land and the water, and now the water's there, and it sort of like rises and falls and things like that. So we have a lot of salt encrusting around it. This is out in the Great Salt Lake, sort of if you go past Salt Lake City, it's kind of out no man's land. It takes a little while on a dirt road to get there. So if you ever want sort of an interesting jaunt, and you can go out there and still walk on this thing today, it's pretty interesting. Performance art, and for Carolee Schneemann, she's also a feminist artist, and so she's moved art outside of the institution and sort of into this free and rebellious state. This is a artwork created that galleries and museums have no control. It is, really sort of the spirit of the 60s, but the tech that we've developed for documentation didn't allow for the best at this moment, right? So you think of video cameras and some not having sound and stuff like that. So it's actually not till later that performance art really gets its launch, when we have things that can devices that can truly give you what that artist wanted from that performance. And so performance arts is much bigger today because of those tech pieces. I added the film here that you guys can check out, and Joseph Boy's How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair. And this is one of those really interesting stories where We have an artist who's emphasizing the spiritual experience art can have for an individual. Beuys himself was shot down in World War II. He's a German soldier. He crashed in the sea, and he was nursed back to health by these nomads that found him in more of the Russian area, and so he's nursed back to health, and they used fat and felt to actually keep him warm to get his body temperature back up. So he uses these symbols in his work. In fact, you can see the felt underneath his foot here, that he kind of keeps it on. And what he's doing is making this, he thinks of himself kind of like a shaman. And so his idea is he takes gold leaf and honey, and that's what's on his face. That's what we're seeing, is sort of what almost looks like a luchador mask, but it's on. And he would step over this fir branch that's in the middle, and you'll see it a little bit here in the film. You can kind of start to see him step over this thing again and again as he explains art to this dead rabbit, right? And he's going for this sort of like moment that you don't even have to be the maker of the art in order to be the artist and the person who enjoys it, right? So he's really sort of launching into what's going to be sort of conceptual art. We also have things like Tingley's, and here's a performance of one of his recreated pieces, and where he's using destruction as creation. He made what was called metamatics, or motor-driven machines that created abstract paintings and drawings. So he'd make a machine that you kind of like a spirograph or something, where you put in the drawing device, and then it would set off and do its own thing. And so the artwork was not even created by human hand. But then also the machines were sort of like, in ways like in this case, were set to sort of destroy themselves, right? So it's pretty interesting why he would add that component, but I find it just sort of interesting in general for, the idea of having the human hand to create something that's not created by the human hand. It's very sort of counter. Conceptual art is the last movement we'll look at, and this is where the artist is saying that it's more about the idea. So they really wanted to rethink what art is, and a challenge was to create works that didn't need to be tangible objects or physical substance to exist. They were looking at sort of the semiotics of Kossuth's chair, which you can see in your book, which is a picture of a chair, an actual chair, and the word chair, right? So really, which one's getting the meaning across, right? Do I have to have a chair to think of chair, or does the word do it itself, right? So what can I do then with my art if it can be any of these three? Well, then they think, well, maybe it's more about the idea, right? That the idea is the work itself, right? And so they're questioning the art's production. And Bruce Nauman, one of the early leaders of it, he uses a medium not associated with art or an artistic function, which is this neon tubing. Now we use it as such, but he's the first to say, well, no, I'm going to use this other material, and I'm just going to put this, this title in there with the true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths, which has its, that he's taking from. And if conceptual art is your thing, you should read more about this, because Nauman really continues, and even to this day, he lives in New Mexico, doing these types of works, different mediums. And Nam June Paik, he's a Korean artist and one of the first to use video as a medium. He really pushed along because he created a synthesizer with this other engineer that allows multiple players to be played on a video played on the same screen, so it's sort of like a video collage, which had never been done. So with his sort of artistic vision helped push technology in a vein where now you think of like having iMovie as an app on your phone, that couldn't have been done before. So he's able to like also tune the video footage as it's being played to get different colors, right? So he's manipulating a lot with kind of like, imagine like a DJ turntable, but for video, to allow all this stuff to happen. So he still is in control. And if you're interested in his work, the YouTube link is there. So thank you so much for checking out all these lectures, and make sure to take the quiz. And some of this that I've highlighted will be on the test.